Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana and May, and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you will be notified when we drop new episodes.
So, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about a few different things, but one of them is we wanted to kind of look back at where we were some years ago. And part of like what started this conversation is we were looking at this recent-ish Instagram trend or social media trend where, people talk about having coffee with their younger self and kind of what they would kind of talk to them about. And this is also like the type of question that we ask anyways on our guest interviews, where we're asking them what advice they would give to their younger self. So that's kind of like what inspired us to like start thinking about making an episode about this and thinking about where we were then, where we are now, and what kind of things could have saved us some precious time and energy and possibly frustration too, had we known it about, say, 5 year-ish years ago versus now.
Yeah, I think especially looking back. So at the time of this recording, 5 years ago was just the start of COVID. And Adriana and I had met a year prior to that, roughly. And so if you've been a listener of our podcast for a while now or from the beginning, you may know that during the summer of 2020 is when both Adriana and I moved into our studios at ArtSpace. But looking back to now the 5 year anniversary of the COVID shutdown. We're a little past that. Once we kind of realized, oh, this is going to be more than a 2 week shutdown. This is going to be something that really impacts all of us. It's so crazy, honestly, to think back to that time because I know me, for one, I was just starting to make artwork again after a crazy burnout after academia. I was working at a corporate job for like an hourly wage, super long hours, feeling super burnt out. And 2020 was my year to like recommit to making an art practice, like whatever that looked like as a quote unquote adult. So for me, like my goal for 2020 was to show one piece of artwork in Raleigh somewhere. Yet alone, like I wasn't even thinking about selling. I wasn't thinking about like specific places I wanted to exhibit, and I wasn't thinking about a profitability of a business. Like that was so far off my radar and I felt so out of reach to where now kind of on that coffee with your younger self trend, like Adriana mentioned, thinking back to if that person from 5 years ago could see now being a full-time working artist with a studio downtown, the people I've met, the connections I've made, but also just from a lifestyle standpoint, kind of like living in my dream apartment downtown, line dancing on a regular basis, having complete creative control, but also freedom of my schedule was such a concept that I didn't think was possible for myself. And it just shows how much can change in 5 years. When you trust the vision that you're setting, when you intentionally make changes in your life towards the life that you want, it I hate being so cheesy, but I can't help it. Like really anything is possible. Or a future that you couldn't even envision is possible. So it's really fun to look back at 5 years ago because I mean I know for you, Adriano, at that point, like I was coming and visiting you at the Carter building. We didn't have studios down the hall from each other quite yet.
No, we didn't. And like looking back, I had spent about a year of trying to basically check things off my list, like my first exhibition, my first art fair. And it was something that I was balancing in between, my weekends or whenever I had a holiday from my corporate job, which was big 9 to 5 type situation. And so around that time, we had met, so also that was like a good rekindling for me of like, oh, this is serious. Like I'm really like here I am at an art critique. I feel so official. This was like end of like late 2019 and things like that. So I made the big leap. I quit my corporate job. December of 2019 was my last day. Obviously not knowing about COVID. If you've heard us on previous episodes, you may have heard the story. But it was like this idea of like 2020 is going to be my year. This is my first year as a full-time artist. I had a short-term lease at the Carter Building, which is also in downtown Raleigh, but it's on, a different side. And I was waiting to hear back from ArtSpace to see if they were going to accept my application to get into the building. Um, but then, of course, COVID hit. And it was like, I think one of the like I think one of the only good things that happened around that time frame was getting the news that I did get into art space. Because honestly, like the whole world shut down. It's like, well, what's going to happen to all the art fairs that just got postponed? Because this was around the time, since we're looking back around that time frame, this was around the time that nobody knew what was canceled and everything was just postponed. Because we all thought it was just going to be like, I don't know, a few weeks. Maybe a
Yeah.
couple months, but nobody thought like everything's like canceled. So it was like this big time of uncertainty. The news came in that both Jackie and I got accepted. So it's like, yay, a tiny, tiny little win in this sea of uncertainty. And then I will say also around that time, my art style had not come forth yet. So that was also like a big concern I had at the time of like, what kind of artwork do I want to do? What kind of artwork do I want to be known for? I was like starting a mentorship with another artist around that time as well. Um, I mean, it turned into one of those like, well, if we can't be out there, then I might as well just like put my head down and focus on my work. So by not having my corporate job, obviously big financial reset with everything else being canceled, but it did give me for those, first months or whatever, um, it did give me the space to say like, you know how they say like if money wasn't an issue, what would you do? Yeah. This is kind of similar, but in a way of like, if money isn't an issue because there is no money because everything's canceled, what would you do? So it kind of turned into that. Luckily, I did have, savings that had prepared, not for COVID, obviously. I had prepared them for what if I didn't sell my art right away. And I was like almost treating it as a sabbatical, anyways, with the idea of like, if this doesn't work out, I'll go back anyways, but I'll still have money to pay my share of the bills. Also sharing bills with somebody else, like that's also helpful as well, when all this went down. So, anyways, looking back, if I had to like talk to my younger self, as part of this conversation, would be to say like, yes, things are gonna get really hard before they get easier, but also those things you're hyper focused on where are you gonna show your work? What's your artwork gonna look like? Are there people that are gonna love your artwork or am I ever gonna find my style and things like that? I'd be able to say like, yeah, you'll work through all that stuff. You will actually get to the other side and not just like find your style niche down on one thing. You're actually going to get to expand and do a lot of fun things that you've been dreaming about. So I think that's what I would go back and say like it's fine. You're going to figure it out. I mean, not
Yeah,
that that would be helpful advice by itself, but still.
right. She'd be like, yeah, easy for you to say. Okay, I need to keep working. But I think, yeah, looking back, I think at the very basic, 5 years ago ourselves would be one, very excited that we are still friends and talking on a regular basis and doing this podcast would be like, what are you talking about? That's amazing. And of course, if you've been listening to our studio updates and the podcast over the years, you've been along that journey with us as we've expanded our art practices, as we've added income streams, as we've celebrated milestones, as we've, I don't know, learned tough lessons along the way. Um, so you can go back and listen to those studio update episodes for all of the nitty-gritty details. But we wanted to keep it a little bit more abstract today with a quick list episode because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, with all of our guests, we asked them, what advice do you wish you knew before you got started on your creative journey? So we thought that we would tackle that question ourselves. So we're going to go ahead and each list a few few pieces of advice that we think our younger selves would want to hear, or just that we wish we could tell them. So, Adriana, what advice do you wish you knew before you got started on your creative journey?
So I think one of the first ones, tying back to the whole being worried about my style, it would be regarding my art practice. I didn't go to art school, so I did not get to try all these different mediums and all these different things with a disciplined approach. It was more like dabble here, dabble there, like a lot of self-taught artists do. So I think for me, one piece I wish I had heard back then was the idea that expanding, into other art, when it comes to one's body of works, will include other disciplines, and it can be challenging, but it's not impossible. You don't just have to stick to this one rigid thing. Like I'm the person that paints native birds of my state, and that is all that I do, right? And no judgment to anybody that does, right? Or I'm the one that always does this kind of doodle or pet portraits or whatever. Like I had like concerns of like how can I not just do this one thing? Like how can I do different things but still kind of like mirror each other or related to each other, and of course like different disciplines and stuff. So I would be like, you know one thing I did hear around the time I was getting mentored by another artist was the idea of identifying what things I was hyper passionate about, what things aesthetically I was drawn to the most, what were the through lines of my work, basically like what themes, what styles, what things are woven through my artwork, from painting to painting, what are the carryovers, and to learn that those are the things that make my artwork not just evolve as I do different series, but also like keep it cohesive. Like they actually like follow each other in line. So even when I try to quote unquote go crazy and experiment with something brand new, even if I'm just playing around, it's like now that I'm aware of what some of those themes are in my work, some of my aesthetic preferences are in my work, chances are whatever I'm playing with, even if it's not a part of my body of work officially, there's going to be something that ties it back. And yeah, basically being able to learn what those through lines are in my work. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that would be a
I love that. And I think your younger self would find a lot of comfort hearing that of, okay, exploring all these things is not a distraction, but it's part of the process.
yep, yep.
Yeah. Looking back, I think one thing that immediately came to mind with this question, and recently changing my business from part-time to full-time definitely makes this top of mind. But I think a piece of advice I would give my younger self would be to learn more about personal finance early, like as soon as possible, because I found especially taking my business full-time and even just the handful of years running it, good business finance often starts with good personal finance. Things such as learning the vocabulary. What is this type of income versus that type of income, profit margins. But also just that personal confidence that comes from assigning every dollar a job. Um, and starting with that when you have a employer who's giving you a paycheck on a regular basis. So focusing on personal finance, taking that as part of the job as a not necessarily as an artist, but as a business owner, because that has been a skill set that I've been so thankful that I've learned and intentionally sought out information about. And I wish I did it a little bit sooner. Not that it would necessarily change anything, but I think confidence wise, it would help. So. How about you?
Yeah,
What's maybe
absolutely.
something that you learned, Adriana, that you wish that you had learned a little bit sooner?
Well, and before I do that, I do want to tie into something you said. I did get lucky enough that not long, even though I did business for my degree, which that was helpful because I already was familiar with the terms that you're discussing as part of my degree. But also, like, not long after completing my degree, my aunt handed me a book called Young, Fabulous, and Broke,
Yeah.
by Susie Orman. I don't know how relevant that book still holds because this was a long time ago. There's probably updated versions of this, but it was like good to learn. I learned business finance essentially. And personal finance wasn't covered that much in my degree, although I did have the basics of it. But this book was more like it's okay to be young and want to spend all your money at Starbucks or at the movie theaters or whatever, but also like set some of it aside for your savings and also pay your bills first and treat your savings like a bill so that
Yeah,
you always take care of it. And then if you want to blow through the rest of what's left over, do it. So it was like a powerful lesson on, and it actually applies to, my art business too, that powerful lesson of like, what are your real liabilities, what are your perceived or goal liabilities, that are not, that are a little more flexible if you have something else coming up, and then what things are you going to spend on without worrying about, and just be like, if I want that tube of paint that's like $20, which is ridiculous because all the other ones are like $5 or less, but it's this color I'm passionate about. If I have it in my budget, just do it, and
right,
just live a little, but it's that balance of like also don't overdo it and only buy expensive paint because you still have to pay studio rent. So it was like,
right.
anyways, I was like really glad, just following up with what you said, that I got to see some of that early on. Definitely a
Yeah.
powerful lesson.
Yeah, and I remember you giving me that book suggestion early on when we were having our like coffee dates in 2019. Um, Transparently, I did not read that book, but again, it was too early. I didn't take my own advice, which is why I'm saying I wish I had. But later on, two books, since you mentioned that one, two books that really helped me, and I did the audiobook versions of them, was Ramit Sethi's I Will Teach You to Be Rich, and Tori Dunlap's Financial Feminist. I feel like both of them definitely have more of the millennial perspective on finances. Sometimes the quote unquote like financial gurus could be of a different generation where some concepts remain, but the economy is very different. And so I just found Ramit and Tori Dunlap's perspectives really refreshing and just the way they talk about it. So if you guys are looking into wanting to increase your personal education on personal finance, I would definitely suggest those books. They also both have podcasts and YouTube channels, as all the good branded millennials do, but they're really good content. So, highly recommend.
Nice, nice. Another advice I wish I had learned earlier on was regarding delegation, and we do have podcast episodes about this where we deep dive, but um that idea that having a supportive network makes all the difference. There's like this pervasive stereotype that goes with artists, that artists are lonely. We can be, right? We do a lot of our work on our own. But that we have to be alone and tortured and we have to figure everything out on our own and all that. And honestly, like being at a place like Art Space, collaborating with other artists like Jackie, and other of our friends, and then going on to even hiring people to help me with different things. It just basically shows you, what strengths there are in collaboration, especially when you're working with people whose strengths either mirror your own or complement your own. Like maybe they're specializing in things that you don't. Like there are some things, I guess, what's the word we're going for here, or the expression, it's basically like this comes with age, understanding this part, but we don't have time to do all the things that we want to do, especially with our art. And sometimes like just deep diving and going into rabbit holes about like how to build certain things that really don't matter, like yes, it's fun, but also like I rather would have spent that time that I spent on X, I don't know, like figuring out how to do something out of resin. It would have been so much easier to just talk to a resin artist and being like, "Hey, can we do a trade?" For example, instead of like me deep diving all these hours into something I never even used in my practice at the end of the day. I mean, it's nice to, yes, research stuff, but I don't know. It's like now learning a little bit more over time, um, that having assistants or having other artists you trade services with can free up so much time. Now lets me concentrate on the things that actually make the most impact, whether that's the art making itself, whether that's the strategy for how my business is going to grow, whether that's like nurturing connections and networking. Like those are things that are not something that are delegatable, meaning that now looking back at my business, I'm like, there's so many things that are delegatable. that I was like, oh, I don't have time to have coffee with this person. Well, if I had somebody else taking care of this part of my business, I would have had time. But anyways, those are things like some of the advice we're sharing. It doesn't mean we would have listened.
True.
It would have been nice to know and been like, oh, I could have delegated, way sooner than I did. Maybe not at the very beginning, 5 years ago, but definitely a few years earlier than I did, for sure.
Yeah. I think kind of similar to my next piece of advice would be something that I don't know if my past self would necessarily take the advice or have heard it, but something I would still tell them, would be in regards to avoiding burnout or attempting to. I think one of the big lessons that I've learned is that taking care of your physical and mental health really is the best thing that you can do for your business and for your creative practice. I've always been a huge fan of working out, eating as healthy as I can, and of course, indulging and splurging. But I think especially when it comes to my relationship with work and like the number of hours that I put in, I can often get in that tunnel vision, what's seen as like workaholic mode of just like go, 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 and that hustle culture in a way. But my advice would be that go, go, go hustle culture does not always work, and it often leads to more recovery and downtime after a burnout than is actually helpful. So, one lesson that I've learned over the years is that it's not just about your work ethic, it's about your rest ethic and how disciplined you can be with recharging your battery, with energizing your body, with getting sleep. Like, sometimes that extra 2 hours in the studio isn't actually helpful long term. Obviously, there's a time and place, and we actually have done episodes about that, but taking care of your physical and mental health is the best thing that you can do for your business. Otherwise, your body's going to shut down and you're going to be out of commission way longer than you would have been if you had planned short term for it. So, I don't know if
Yeah,
my
for
past
sure.
self would have done that or taken that advice doing 16, 18-hour days, but that's advice I would give for sure.
Yeah, no, neither did mine. Neither did mine. So preaching to the choir, as they say. I think another piece of advice I wish I had heard was regarding confidence, honestly. And it was this idea that saying no is hard, or acknowledging that saying no can be hard for those of us that have been brought up as people pleasers, whether it's cultural, religious, a combination, or just the way our families are structured, whatever. Um, and the jobs that we've done. I don't know. It's a combination of things, right? Yes, I'd go to therapy, just so y'all know, to help with some of this stuff. But it's like the more, yeah, saying no is hard, but the clearer that I've become on my long-term objectives, whether they're personal, whether they're business oriented, whether they're about my creative practice, the easier it's become to say no and instead focus on the things you know, that I want to specialize on, that I want to share with others, whether that's like special moments with my loved ones or a specific art style or sharing forward or teaching with others, the different things that I've learned or community interactions, things of that nature. Whereas before I would have said, oh, you asked me, I am so like, I can't say no. Like, you've asked me, so now I feel obligated to say yes to this thing that I'm not necessarily passionate about. Um, because I am trying to stay open minded, but I'm also people pleasing. Like, let's be realistic. So, anyways, I wish I had learned earlier on to say no to the things that I wasn't sure would ignite me or serve me. I still wouldn't have said no to everything. There's still things that I'm glad that I went through because then I wouldn't have known that they weren't a right fit. So I'm glad I still said yes to things that were not a good fit. So I learned from there. But yeah, there was a lot of things I should have said no to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of my last pieces of advice that kind of piggybacks off of that, a piece of advice to my younger self would be to trust your own vision for your future. I think I was very guilty of going through like the checklist of life of like doing kind of from a people pleasing standpoint, like doing what I thought I was quote unquote supposed to do. And I think most adults hit that point where you realize like one, no one else actually cares. Like people are focused on themselves and they think about you a lot less than you think. But also like that idea of with any entrepreneur, I think especially as creatives, I've heard this quote that I feel like perfectly sums it up, where it's like at first they'll ask why you're doing it, and then they'll ask how you did it. To where starting to wake up early before my day job to paint in my quote unquote studio, which was the second bedroom of my monthly rent apartment where I was like, okay, everyone's like, why are you getting up so early? Why are you doing this thing? And then now, years later, kind of feeling some of the benefits of that, where you're like, that's incredible that you're a full-time artist. I could never do that. How did you become a full-time artist? Where it's like, 5 years ago, you people were doubting me, saying, like, why are you doing all these crazy things? Why are you working so much? But seeing that it does pay off when you trust your vision and when you're disciplined with, to your point, Adriana, like having that crystal clear vision of like, these are the things that I want to pursue. These are things that don't serve me. And then maybe there's a handful in the middle that you're like, I need to test these out for myself so I know which category they fit in. But just trusting your own vision because people that don't see what you see for your future may doubt you or question you. But then once you bring it to life, people are gonna be in amazement of what you've brought to life. So just trusting that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things, to wrap up, like advice I would give my younger self, without making it a, what's it called, a cheesy, little fortune slip, type situation, is this idea that adaptability and resilience can get you through the toughest of times. And I don't just mean global pandemic, obviously, just in general, especially having creative jobs, there's so much up and down. This is not a steady paycheck. Also, creativity is cyclical, where, the ideas just flood in, but then you don't have enough time to execute on all of them. Or you have like drier seasons of like, nothing's coming to me. Is it over? Like there's so much of a roller coaster involved in it. And it's like, again, if you have like clarity of what your goals are and your purpose is solid, then you are way more likely to be equipped to navigate, when things go go down or when they go up at a speed that you were not prepared for, then you're a lot more likely to be able to navigate that boat, so to speak, and move through it and basically like figure stuff out, like, and ask help, obviously, but being able to get through that for sure.
Yeah, I think my final wrap up piece of advice, which is kind of tongue in cheek, especially if people know me, I'm a very structured and planning type A person. Kind of along the lines of COVID, is basically just like structure and control is all an illusion. Later learning that's also a coping mechanism of like trying to think that you can plan for the future, but you really can't. Whether it's a global pandemic, whether it's a commission project that funding gets pulled last minute, whether it's a client that you think they're about to purchase and then they just ghost you. Like you can plan as much as you want, but ultimately to your point, you have to be adaptable, you have to be resilient, and just trust that vision that you've set. So, structure and control is an illusion, but everything will be okay in the end. So now, as we've been looking back, it's been obviously a wild 5 years, but overall, as we wrap up, I just want to say I feel like I'm so glad that we have each other, Adriana, but also like the community that we've built locally here in Raleigh through this podcast with our listeners and on Instagram, and really just having the podcast to document this journey, to share forward what we've learned along the way. And I know I've gone back and listened to some of our previous studio updates in our first year or two of doing the podcast. And I found so much comfort, one, in like hearing the excited, energized words of our past selves, kind of like words of encouragement. is so nice, but also to see that as a tangible thing of 3 years ago, I was so worried about this one part of my business. And then to see, oh, well, that really has expanded and it's worked out to be a profitable income stream or a fulfilling art series, or to realize, like, yeah, you're stressed out about this and it didn't work out and it was like huge learning lesson, but I'm so glad that I was part of that. So it's so nice to have the podcast as also like a tangible asset to document this journey that we're on because the roller coaster keeps on going and we're excited to have you guys along the journey with us.
Yeah, for sure. And, for those of us that, or those of you that are like, but I'm not going to start a podcast, some tangible advice that you can implement. There's various ways in which you can do this. You can record voice memos. You can write an actual letter to yourself. I know some artists that do this every year or every few years, and then they open it, when the time comes. You can do a journal or keep a private blog. Nobody else has to see this, but you can be honest and vulnerable on social media if you're comfortable with it. Although, if you do that, please keep your originals in case that platform that you chose is no longer around. You still have your originals. But basically, anything that can help you document your journey so that however many years from now you can look back and see how far you've come. I don't know, like being able to look back, at least for me, when we look at back at some of the older episodes, it's almost like a time capsule. And I'm really glad that we live in this day and age, whether or not some of those original episodes might feel a little cringe for me sometimes. I'm like, oh, why did I say that? At the
Mhm.
same time, I'm like, how sometimes you'll look at an artist that you admire, not that I'm saying I will be that artist you admire, but you look at an artist you admire and then you go, dang, I wish like they had left some journals behind or something, anything, like there's some poets and painters that are so well documented. And then there's others that we find that we love, whether they're still living or not, that then you're like, there's nothing. Like I wish I don't know, even if they just said what they like to eat for breakfast, like you just kind of like want to find those point of connection. So I'm glad that we do this through the podcast, and I hope you'll do something like that, whether it's for collectors or your family or for yourself to review years down the road. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's conversation, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you will find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
And if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share your feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram.
You can also visit us at levelupartist.com to get immediate access to template resources and more to level up your creative career today.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you in the next episode.